Today I'm going to talk about John Marshall. John Marshall was the father of Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall played an important role in defining power of the federal and the state governments during the early 19th century. As Chief Justice of the United States, John Marshall helped to ensure that the political and economic systems were based on a strong central government. I'm going to talk about three cases he's most famous of. The first one is the most famous one. It's called the Marbury vs. Madison. In Marbury vs. Madison, the Supreme Court announced for the first time the principle that a court may declare an act of Congress void if it is inconsistent with the Constitution. William Marbury had been appointed as the Justice of Peace by Adams in the government. However, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State, was told by Thomas Jefferson to refuse to deliver Marbury's commission. Marbury, joined by three other similar situated appointees, petitioned for a writ for mandamus. So John Marshall thinks William Marbury has the right to get remedy and gain his position back. However, before John Marshall's time, the power of Supreme Court was little. So, for example, there was an original law stated that only people who has high rank and like senator or president can submit writ to the Supreme Court directly. Marshall was there to create judicial review to extend original law and give normal people rights to submit writs to Supreme Court directly. As a result, because of his assertion of judicial review, the court gained its power by being an equal branch of government, such as, for example, the court can rule a law passed by Congress as unconstitutional. It is also an equal in power to the Congress and President. So it becomes powerful as other branch of the government, and it is no longer weak anymore. It's the first case, and I'm going to talk about the second case, which is Fletcher versus Peck. It is the dispute over the regions around the river called Yazoo. There were voters who want to vote for if the place should be sold for 1.5 cents per acre. It was soon found out that everyone was bribed to agree to sell the land except the legislator. As a result of public outrage, most of the legislators lost the following election, and the new legislature passed a statute in 1796, essentially nullifying the transactions. Those who had already purchased the land refused to accept the return of their purchase price, and much of the land was resold to other purchasers at great profit. However, there was one man called Fletcher, Robert Fletcher, purchased 15,000 acres from John Peck. However, Fletcher cannot have the clear title to the land because he was limited by the Act of the State of Georgia, which stated that the lands bought by Fletcher were fully belonged to the state. Eventually, Fletcher sued Peck. So there are two results for the case. Either the act was constitutional and the contract was void, or the act was unconstitutional and Fletcher had clear title to the land. In order to protect individual rights, the Supreme Court ruled that a grant to a private land company was a contract that once made could not be repealed. In addition, Marshall established a law that negates all property rights established under earlier law, and the act was unconstitutional for violating the contract clause of the United States Constitution. So this case is important because it is the first time Supreme Court struck down a state law on constitutional grounds. It is the first time that the Supreme Court went against the Constitution. Then I'm going to talk about the third case, which is McCulloch versus Maryland. This case is important because, before the case, it was not clear what Congress was allowed to do. There are very specific things that Constitution says Congress may do. For example, chartering banks. However, the Constitution never says what the Congress can do. They only say that they may do. So John Marshall set up a broad definition of the power of Congress under the Constitution. In Maryland, there's a bank depression in 1819. State government of Maryland and State Bank blamed the private bank for depression. And in 1819, the state of Maryland tried to put heavy tax on all private banks, even including those not chartered in Maryland. These banks, especially those owned by McCulloch, asked the Congress to charter them in order to prevent taxes. However, the Maryland state law said that the Constitution gave the Congress no right to do so. Eventually, the Supreme Court interfered. John Marshall said because the creation of bank was appropriately related to the Congress' legitimate power to tax, borrow, and do other commercial activities, the private bank was constitutional under the necessary and proper clause. And in order to prevent the situations like this happening again, McCulloch suggested and finally approved by John Marshall that he has two important principles. The first one is the Constitution grants to Congress implied power for implementing the Constitution's express power in order to create a functional national government. So it mainly said that John Marshall gave the Congress full power, like what they can do instead of what they may do. Second, state action may not impede valid exercise of power by the federal government. That's federal government's power over the state's power. So, in conclusion, John Marshall is important because he makes Supreme Court become the most powerful thing in the jurisdictional system. In addition, he defined other authorities' power in order to prevent them from abusing power, which also significantly benefits state society. And here's my works cited, here's the image cited, and thank you.